And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at tonight's weather, we've got low pressure here south of the Alaska Peninsula, front right along the Alaska Peninsula and across the Barren Islands here, and then east and southeast into the Gulf of Alaska, staying south of the Panhandle. So periods of rain for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, and the Kodiak Island will continue, and weak system with some light rain or snow for the far western Aleutians. That's about it. Another mostly clear and cold night again across much of interior Alaska, including the northern Panhandle. And from there to tomorrow, we've got weakening low pressure here, still south of the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. So less in the way of wind and lighter rainfall amounts there, but still a wet day for the eastern Aleutians, a lot of clouds for the Alaska Peninsula. And then some moisture here getting picked up off the ocean with this easterly flow, keeping a chance of rain in over Kodiak Island and the extreme southern Kenai Peninsula area. Clear over the interior with winds not too bad. A little breezy still over the Panhandle with mostly clear skies now even there, and not much going on out to the west over the Bering Sea. And then for Thursday, we have a front bringing increasing wind and rain here to all of the Aleutians, southern Bering Sea, but staying dry and clear, mostly clear over the interior, all the way down now in toward Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay. Some shower activity here for the Alaska Peninsula, and that's about it. And a front comes northward here, bringing periods of light rain into the southern Panhandle, but stays chilly and windy for the northern southeast coast. Excuse me. And for the south coast tomorrow, east winds 20, gusting 35 knots. And for the central coast, east winds at 25, gusting 40 knots. And easterlies 25 to 30 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, winds out of the north at 30 knots with higher gusts. And 20 knot southeast winds for Clarence Strait. And for the day on Thursday, north winds 30 knots over the central and northern inner channels, north of 25 now for Clarence Strait. And for much of the coastline here, we're looking at easterly winds at 25, maybe 30 knots with seas anywhere from 8 to 11 feet. Prince William Sound for tomorrow, northeast 15 knots, east winds 25 to 30 knots, western North Gulf Coast, but east at 45 knots for the Barren Islands, northeast 40 knots for both Kamishak Bay and the western North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings for southern Cook Inlet, northeast winds 35 knots. And then for Cook Inlet on Thursday, northeast winds 10 to 20 knots, northeast 20 knot winds, Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, and much of the North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 15 knots. Kodiak Island, east winds 20 knots, except Shelikof Strait there. Gale warnings for northeasterlies at 35 knots and east winds at 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, 25 knots for Bristol Bay. And for Kodiak on Kodiak Island, Thursday, east to northeast, 25 to 30 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, easterlies 25 to 35 knots. Northeast winds down to 20 knots for Bristol Bay. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, north winds 25 to 30 knots. North to northwest winds at 25 knots for the central Aleutians. And for the western Aleutians there, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Western Aleutians on Thursday, gale warnings, east to north winds or north to east winds or north to northeast winds at 40 knots. Gale warnings also for Adak and Atka here. In fact, gale warnings all of the Aleutians for east winds at 35 to 40 knots. And then for Norton Sound tomorrow, we've got northeast winds in the forecast at 15 knots. Light northeast winds for St. Lawrence Island about 15 knots, as well as the Yukon Delta Coast. Kuskokwim Delta Coast on down across the Pribilof Islands, northeast winds at 30 knots. And for the day on Thursday, Norton Sound, brisk wind advisory again, northeast winds 25 knots, but winds staying about 15 knots for St. Lawrence Island. And for the southwest coast here, east to northeast winds at 20 knots. Otherwise, gale warnings, St. Matthew Island and the Pribilofs, east at 35 knots with 13-foot seas. Up to the north, central eastern Arctic coast, east to northeast wind 15 knots, brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast for east winds at 30 knots. Otherwise, the Chukchi Sea looking at east to northeast winds at just 5 to 15 knots. And then for the day on Thursday, western Arctic coast still looking at a brisk wind advisory for easterlies at 30 knots. And east winds 25 knots for the Chukchi Sea. Central eastern Arctic coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots.